In the interests of time. Welcome everybody. My name is Melinda Jones. I'm the President of National Council of Jewish Women Australia. At the national level, we also have sections in various states. We have one in Victoria, in Brisbane, in the Gold Coast, in Sydney, in WA, wherever, Canberra. Soon to have one hopefully in Adelaide and maybe in some other places. So if you want to start a section in wherever you live, tell me about it and we can talk about it. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people who are the traditional owners of the land where I am currently. We are meeting in Australia on land that's unceded territory, and I want to acknowledge the leadership of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and of other Indigenous peoples around the country. We're here to discuss a very serious matter tonight. On other occasions, we've had occasion to be flippant and to be laughing. So tonight's subject is a debrief in the case of Malka Leifer. Now, Malka Leifer, as I'm sure you all know, has been accused of many counts of indecent assault and rape. We're going to confirm the details of the charges and all of these things, which is why I'm being a little bit casual about it. We'll go into the details in a few minutes. And so subject is looking at child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse happens in every community, and the Jewish community is not exempt from that. In the Jewish community, we have the case where Malka Leifer has been charged with, in terms of her alleged assault on various young women in the Adus community, and the women have been incredibly brave and tenacious, fighting over a number of years. I think we're 7 years, 2012, 9 years? 2012, I think. Does that make 8 years? Something like that. To come to have a day in court and to seek justice. The subject we're dealing with, as I said, is a very serious one, but it's also one that can easily cause distress for you as our community. And so we've taken the precaution tonight of inviting along, now I'm going to forget Deborah's surname, Deborah Lewis, who is here from Sakasa and from SEDEC. Deborah is a counsellor and advocate at Sakasa, as well as a redress worker for SEDEC. Her role is to assess the Jewish community for individuals who've had experience with sexual abuse in institutions through the National Redress Scheme. She has a collaboration with a legal firm, the No More Legal Service, which is a free legal service which provides access to people who are victims of sexual assault in institutions, and she works with people to try and get a form of justice through a compensation model. Deborah is here tonight to talk to anybody who would like to talk to her. But before we do that, Deborah, I'd like you to just introduce yourself for a minute and explain to us, please, what is Sakasa and also what is SEDEC?
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. So Sakasa is the Southeastern Centre Against Sexual Assault, and we're for the whole community, Jewish and non-Jewish, to help anyone who's experienced sexual assault, sexual abuse, childhood or recent, and family violence. As part of my role at Sakasa, so that's what the counsellor advocates do at Sakasa, is to give counselling around that. I also have a role as a SEDEC redress worker. So basically, for redress, it's only for the Jewish community and the work that I do, and it is to assist anyone who has experienced institutional abuse, sexual abuse. But that is a very broad word. So when we talk about institutions, I'm thrilled to have been asked to come tonight because if I've got the opportunity, just to let you know that an institution doesn't mean that it's a physical institution. So if anyone tonight is triggered in any way, and you'll be told that you could chat with me, and I could potentially help you get counselling at SACASA, or a monetary compensation from through the redress scheme. So basically, it could be anything that's to do, if you think that you have experienced anything to do with any institution on the grounds or not, please let us know, because we may be able to help you.
So by institution, you mean schools, synagogues, community groups like National Council of Jewish Women?
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be on premises. So it's actually, I'm working with No More and getting a lot of training about what it means. So it's actually quite wide. I always understood it meant that it was in an institution, just like the whole thing with Malka, Leifer, or whatever. But no, it's much wider. So that's why I really want the Jewish community to know there is a way of getting some sort of redress. Okay.
Really very, very traumatizing to have this experience. And we'll hear more about some of the general experience that people have a bit later on. Danielle, can you explain to people how they contact Deborah if they'd like to speak to her this evening?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. If you need to contact Deborah this evening, at the bottom of your screen, you'll have a chat function. When you open chat, it comes up to everybody. And obviously you may not wish to share with everybody that you're distressed. So you can click on that everybody, and we've renamed Deborah as #1 Counselling Deborah Debbie Lewis. So she should come up in the first 4 or 5 in your list to be able to send her a direct message. If you have any problem with that, please feel free to send me a message and I'll make sure that Deborah is in contact with you. Back to you, Melinda.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I was just checking to see that that worked, and it does. Thank you very much. So we'll now turn to the immediate purpose of our evening, which is, in the light of the decision of the Supreme Court of Israel on Monday that Malka Leifer should be extradited to Australia. Of course, that's not the final step, but maybe we'll go back one step. So let me introduce you to Itai Fleischer. When I asked the women who were girls when they were abused by Malka Leifer, Dusty Ehrlich, Nicole Meyer and Ellie Sapper, who they would like to speak this evening, they said to me, without any doubt, Itai is the person in the world, one of 2 people in the world, who they completely trusted to give an accurate and appropriate account of what has gone on. So Itai, not only do we know you and love you well, but you've come so incredibly highly recommended this evening. Itai used to be a school teacher in Melbourne for 15 years, but then he decided to leave us and make Aliyah in 2018. So what he decided to do in Israel was to become the Jerusalem correspondent, this amongst other things that he's doing, for Plus 61J Media. And Itai, for his sins, has heard over 200 hours of testimony relating to the Malka Leifer extradition case. And he has been in the Jerusalem District Court and the Supreme Court of Israel. And he, as I said, is an expert on the subject. So Itai, would you do me the favour and just take us right back to the beginning and tell us a little bit about the story of Malka Leifer and how it is that she's in Israel at all? What's this all about?
Yeah, so Shana Tova to everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me here. So Malka Leifer is a Nadvorna Hasid, which is a specific Hasidic sect. Her husband Jacob is from the Gur Hasidic community. She was invited to Australia in the year 2000 to be the principal of the Adas Israel School. The reason they invited her to be the principal was because she was very well regarded, and they wanted someone very frum and that represented, Torah values as they saw it, and that's why she was given a 457 visa to come to Australia for that position. And I was a teacher at the boys' school at the time, but I know from female teachers who were at the girls' school at the time, she definitely had a good reputation. She was very popular. A lot of girls wanted to be around her, and follow her and all of that sort of thing. And one of the and to not tell you the whole story, but in 2008, Darcy revealed her sexual abuse to a psychiatrist, and then that psychologist revealed that to the school board, and then the school decided, instead of reporting her to the police, as they are required to by the law in Victoria where there's mandatory reporting, they sent her to Israel. So she was on a plane within 4 hours of the school being notified of these allegations, and then they also sent her all of her children, and they paid for the tickets as well. There was a civil case about this in 2015 with Justice Rush, who found the school criminally negligible for facilitating her escape to Israel. The school was fined over $1 million. It's one of the highest ever payouts in a sexual abuse case. So jumping now to 2014, there was a warrant put out on her arrest for 74 cases of child sexual abuse involving anywhere between 8 and 15 girls. The only 3 who are now women, obviously, are Darcy, Ellie and Nicole, and they're really the public face of this campaign and really a great inspiration for me, and I think for many people, in the unrelenting fight that they've taken to. It's a real David and Goliath struggle, what they're trying to do here. And since 2014, there's been 71 cases, of which I've been to about 30 of them. They last anywhere between an hour and 5 hours. It's a very grueling process. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a journalist, but often in the court you hear very long and tedious legal arguments of historic cases. There's a fair bit of victim blaming thrown into it as well. It's not an easy thing to listen to, and also I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but I used to be, and I see a lot of the people in the court, especially Leifer supporters, holding mezuzot and kameot and chamsas and reading Tehillim and really beseeching God to save her, to not send her to the country of the Goyim. And I feel sick that my religion that I love and hold as being precious and beautiful is often used to justify protecting this woman.
Thank you for that, Itai. When we had a conversation with our new 2 Orthodox female rabbis that we have in Australia, one of the things that was asked was, how can you live as an Orthodox Jew with behaviour that is so clearly contrary to Judaism? Because there's no question at all that, some weird religions support sexual abuse, but Judaism certainly does not find that acceptable. Is there discussion of this as a problem amongst the community that you see? I'm sorry, I'm throwing this as a curveball, I think.
Yeah, that's okay. Look, the issue of child sexual abuse in Orthodox schools, obviously with yeshiva, has gotten a lot of attention in Australia, so I'm not going to go through that whole history, but I will say in Israel, especially with the Gur Hasidic community, of which Yaakov Litzman is a member, there's a deep reluctance to talk about sexual abuse, and especially when it's female to female sexual abuse, which in their mind just doesn't exist. Like, it's, maybe they'll understand a male predator, but a female predator is just unheard of. And a lot of people would just believe, as Malka Leifer does, by the way, herself, that she was just showing the children love and she didn't do anything wrong because she was being a loving teacher, which is obviously ridiculous. I won't go into the details of what she did, but it was definitely not showing love. And so, yeah, I think there's a taboo topic about it. There was, obviously, you're all aware of the political interference from the health minister of Israel, where he allegedly threatened a psychiatrist, Dr. Jacob Chans, with his job if he didn't write a fake medical report for Malka Leifer, which is part of the reason why this case is extended for many years. So, look, I also teach health and gender education. When I was at Mount Scopus, I was running groups for boys, and I think it's very, very important for all schools to be teaching about healthy relationships and gender and understanding their body parts and all of this sort of stuff from a very young age. And sadly, that doesn't happen in Haredi schools in Israel, at least to the extent where I'd like to see that happening. And there's a lot of cultural reasons for that. And then the last issue is the issue of shidduchim. So in order to get married, you need to go to a matchmaker and you need to have a certain reputation to get married. And if your reputation is as a person who came forward and complained about sexual abuse, you're going to find it very, very hard to get married in a Hasidic community. And I think the way we marry people in Hasidic communities needs to change. I think that's a huge part of the problem that not many people address, because there's a lot of shame. Even if you're the brother or sister of someone that's sexually abused, you know, you're considered like damaged goods, or, you know, you're not worthy. And I think that whole shidduch system needs to change, that it can be okay to come and tell your story and to seek justice from your perpetrator without facing consequences that sadly happen all too often in Haredi communities, especially in Israel.
Yeah. So one of the arguments that was put to the court was that she shouldn't be allowed to come back to Australia because prison in Australia is no place for an Orthodox Jew. Now, we could say that an Orthodox Jew, of course, it's no place for an Orthodox Jew, but, you know, how did the court respond to that argument?
So that was raised in, we were up to court case 70, but that was raised in court case number 69, that the Yehuda Fried and Tal Gabay said that it's difficult to get kosher food in Australian prisons, and it's difficult to have a minyan, and, you know, all of these sorts of cases. Matana Kiva, the state attorney, actually brought a letter from the Australian Prison Service saying they have no problem giving kosher food to Jewish prisoners, and this was an issue. And the judge in her ruling 2 days ago actually dismissed that argument. There's a specific dot point in her judgment where she says that given that Leifer was a resident of Australia during the time the alleged crimes happened, that there's no reason to prevent her. Look, the defence is clutching at straws now. They ran this mental health argument for been 6 years now of court cases, and they've dismissed that, and so now they're looking for other arguments to prevent their extradition, and they're hoping that this kosher food will be another one of the more ridiculous ones I heard on Monday was that they said that there's been unlawful political pressure from Australia on behalf of Dussie, sort of alleging that the ZFA and Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison that have all raised this issue with Benjamin Netanyahu and John Howard as well, have been sort of somehow manipulated Netanyahu into agreeing. By the way, the only thing Netanyahu has said about this case was that if there is a court ruling that says she should be extradited, that he won't stop the extradition. So he hasn't interfered in the case at all. He's just saying that he'll follow the extradition treaty. The other thing is, just on a legal aspect, in the extradition treaty signed between Australia and Israel, you don't need to find the person guilty in Israel before you send them to Australia. That's not what the treaty says. And what they're doing in court is they're essentially running the whole trial here. And that's not the criteria for extradition. The criteria for extradition is just, are you able to understand the charges against you? And are those charges a crime? And I think with the mental health thing, we've now shown that Malka Leifer definitely does understand the charges against her, and also it's clear that those things that she's alleged of are a crime. So once you've proven those things, you don't need to try the whole case here. But what I think the defense are trying to do is really try the whole case in Israel, in the hope that but it's ridiculous to try the case because Dusty, Nicole, and Ellie aren't even in the court. So how can you try a case where the only voice you're giving is to the alleged perpetrator? So anyway, I understand it as a legal strategy. It clearly draws out the court case for a long time, but it's very, very painful for the victims that it should be allowed to run in this manner.
Before I ask you my next question, I'd just like to ask people, if you have a question for Itai about the case itself, please type it into the chat now, because we're going to have a couple more questions with Itai and then move to our other speakers. Itai, I just want to say something again about the alleged political interference in the case, because people may not be aware of this. So Jeremy Liebler, sorry, had a blank for a minute, who's the current president of the Zionist Federation of Australia, was with a number of other politicians in Israel, met with Netanyahu, and one of the many things they talked about was this case. And they said to Netanyahu, you know, we trust that you won't interfere with the case, something along those lines. And this is now being used as another excuse, which is what the political interference that Itai was referring to was about. The other thing that I think we can say about the dragging out of the process is that this was also to try and get the victims to withdraw from the case, because if you exhaust people through the legal system, you get this idea of legal fatigue, and that would, every time there's a case, this is triggering for the victims. Every time there's a mention in the press. Before we ran this session, I checked with the victims to make sure that they were okay, that it wasn't going to cause more problems for them. So, Itai, what do you think is going to happen next? We've said the trial's taken a long time. Is it going to keep on going, or what's going to happen next?
So the next step in the trial is the defence have 30 days to lodge an appeal, which I'm almost sure they will. Then that appeal will be heard in the Supreme Court of Israel in front of 3 judges. If those 3 judges reject the appeal, as I assume they will, then it will go to the Justice Minister, who at the moment is Avi Nissenkorn from the Blue and White Party. He has said, he already released a statement on Twitter yesterday that he said that he will approve the extradition. He has no reason to stop it. And once he approves the extradition, then she can get on a plane, and then the court case would begin in Australia. I don't know exactly how long that would take, because everything in Israel is delayed. We're also in a lockdown at the moment, so that could also be a further reason to delay proceedings, and flights is a very complicated issue now. So I don't think it would happen this year. I think maybe at best early 2021 if everything goes to plan. Now, there's also the unlikely scenario that the appeal is accepted, and then that puts us in a very difficult situation for those who are seeking justice. Just in terms of the other questions that I saw being asked in the chat, why can't she be tried in Israel? Because the crimes were committed in Australia. She hasn't committed any crime in Israel, so they can't try her in Israel for a crime she didn't commit here. However, this is important to note, there are allegations that in Bnei Brak, before she was sent to Australia, that she was touching girls inappropriately. And there's also an article in the Sydney Morning Herald from 2016 that says that there was an allegation that she was tutoring a girl privately, and again was touching her legs and doing inappropriate things. So there does seem to be a pattern of behaviour, but both those cases I mentioned, the girls never went to police, so that can't be accepted as evidence in court. The question about who is paying for the case, I have no idea. I know it's several million shekels have been spent on this now. They've got really top lawyers, Nick Kaufman, Hagabay, Yehuda Fried, who are experts in this area, who hang on to every argument, who fight very, very fiercely for everything, and I'm sure take very heavy fees for their time. And there was a report last year that there was a rabbi in Ashdod that was saying that this is pidyon shvuim, this notion of saving a captive, and that he was raising money for them. But I think there's other donors whose names are not public that are supporting this, that for whatever reason don't want her sent to Australia. I don't know who they are, but I would be very interested to find out.
Did you see it? Did you have any response to any of the other questions that were there?
Sorry, I'm just reading the questions now. Look, do I have faith in the Israeli legal system? So, look, there's another problem here, that the Prime Minister himself is also on trial, as well as is the former Health Minister Yaakov Litzman, and so everything here with the justice system is very complicated. If you read the news every day, the Prime Minister of Israel says that there's a conspiracy in the courts and the police, that they're all out to get him, that they make fake reports, and that all the crimes he's accused of aren't really real. And even when he goes to court, he gives speeches outside the court, attacking the Attorney General and attacking the courts, and saying that they stitch up cases. So there's a real issue here with the people's faith in the legal system, which has to do with having a prime minister on trial. You know, I haven't covered any other case except the Malka Leifer case. My journalism is generally not about this topic. I write more about Israeli society and religion and those sorts of things. But I feel like, you know, I was on a jury once in Australia, and I remember just from that experience, they said the case is going to last 2 weeks. Come every day for 2 weeks, and then it'll be over, and then go back to your life. And here, there's a hearing, and then for 3 months there's nothing, and then there's another hearing, and then for 2 weeks there's another one, and there's another hearing. And I don't get why they just don't say we're going to allocate 2 weeks, do hearings every day in the 2 or 3 weeks that it takes, and just get it out. Like, why have 2 or 3 months between each court date? I don't know if there's not enough lawyers, or there's not enough judges, or there's not enough courtroom. Just the whole way they manage the caseload in Israel just seems bizarre to me, that it's allowed to drag on. And in the same way, Netanyahu's trial has gone on for now 6 months, and he's had 2 court dates. So if he's going to end up having 70 court dates, you know, his trial will also take 6 or 7 years. Like, it just doesn't seem like an effective way to run a justice system. And I think it sends a terrible message to victims of sexual abuse, that if you want justice, that you have to be willing to endure such a long torment. I think it's a horrible way to seek justice, and I wish there was a better way to do it in order to remove this horrible phenomenon from our society.
Itai, thank you so very, very much. You've really enlightened us and helped us understand what's going on now. That's been great.
So, and I'll just add, sorry, I need to go in about half an hour because I'm doing another Zoom call. But I will post the website of Plus 61J where you can read my journalism, and also my email in the chat. If anyone has any other questions that they would like to ask, I'm happy to answer them before I have to go. Yeah.
Okay, so please post questions for Itai, and he'll either answer you privately or we'll send them on to him as well. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to looking more generally about what's been happening in Australia in the context of child sexual abuse. And we're going to now hear from Catherine Levy. Now, Catherine is an extraordinary woman. I'm not going to read you her whole CV because that would take all night. But she has been working, she's currently working for the Catholic Church, and she might tell us something more about this. But in this whole area of institutional sexual abuse and in the context of redress schemes. And one of the things I think is most important to say, and although Catherine didn't put this in her bio per se, her concern overall is with child safety. She says that, but she's got the most awful job, if you ask me, because she's reading all these terrible cases about child sexual abuse and having to be involved in the decision-making about the redress scheme, about what money should go to people in terms of compensation for injury that happened within the Catholic Church. So she's daily reading the most horrific accounts. And I think that in itself deserves an award for being able to cope with that. So, Catherine, perhaps you could actually tell us a little bit more about you and why you've got something really to add to this conversation. Do you want to talk maybe about your involvement with the Jewish community and a bit about what you're doing in the Catholic community?
Yes, thanks, Melinda. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight, and Shana Tova to everyone. Yes, I have the strangest job for a Jewish woman, I admit that's true. But I started off working in this field around 20 years ago when I was engaged by the Jack and Robert Smorgon Foundation to run the Australian Council for Children and Youth Organisations, which looked at how do we protect children in institutions and organisations. And we created standards and accreditation and training. And so I just wanted to frame it in that context that way before the Royal Commission and way before the Betrayal of Trust inquiry, the Jewish community was interested in preventing child sexual abuse and was aware of the problem. Now, that was very radical at the time because government wasn't of the belief that there was a problem in institutions or organisations. So we would go to speak to government, we'd be knocking on doors in Canberra and right around the country, in fact, and talking about this matter. And the response was, no, abuse doesn't happen in institutional organisations, it happens in families. So we're not going to interfere in this. This is not something we're going to fund. So that campaign went on for quite a long time, and the Australian Council for Children and Youth Organisations was instrumental in the implementation of the Working with Children check in Victoria and in some other states as well. So I've had a long history of working with organisations, wide variety of organisations in this field, but also working in the Jewish community because of the involvement of the Smorgon family and their foundation, who are really lobbying for change and lobbying for Jewish organisations and lobbying for Jewish funders to take this on as a major issue and priority.
So perhaps you could just tell us about the Working with Children check. Is that useful in terms of preventing child sexual abuse?
It is just one measure of a raft of measures that needs to be implemented by organisations. When organisations simply rely on the Working with Children check, it's ineffective. It's a deterrent for people who have a criminal history. However, child sexual abuse is one of the most underreported crimes of all. So because of its underreporting and because of the unlikelihood that someone will be convicted, then it's only one measure that can be taken by an organisation. And one of the problems is that it has all sorts of limitations, because while the first check, for example, in Victoria, and each state is different, so we need a national system working with children checks. The first check looks at the national picture, so whether you've committed crimes in other states as well, but then on a weekly basis, the Working with Children check checks in Victoria only against Victorian databases. So if you commit a crime in New South Wales and you're living in Victoria, it won't show up on the weekly systematic check that occurs.
So you said to me that if I'm running a colouring in competition for children, even if it's a virtual one, that I would still really, our organisation really should have a Working with Children check. Is that correct? Even if it's completely online?
Yes, so each state is different. I know we've got people here from different states, but in Victoria, for example, there are the child safe standards, Victorian child safe standards, and I know that nationally, national principles for child safety will be implemented eventually across all states. So at the moment, yes, if you are engaging in any form of interaction with children from an institutional or organisational context, you need to implement the child safety standards.
So we know from the Malka Leifer case that even if you have fantastic criminal laws and laws that will convict somebody if they commit an offence, if you're lucky and you can survive through the system and actually bring the charges, and as you say, it first has to be reported, then you have to survive through the process. And that's not really a satisfactory way of managing a problem. We need to manage the problem through the structural, institutional structures. And that's why the Royal Commission was so important, I think, in looking not just at what happened, but and so that obviously disclosed a lot of stories, told lots of people's story. But it also said we needed to do something about this systemically. Is that correct?
Yes, so the Royal Commission made a whole raft of recommendations, and it's incumbent upon organisations to implement those recommendations. And just funnily enough, today I was reporting on behalf of the Catholic Church for how we're tracking against the implementation of the recommendations. So the government hasn't said, well, there's the Royal Commission, it's all finished, that's it. The government has said, this is the Royal Commission recommendations. Show us how you're tracking against the Royal Commission recommendations. Show us what you're doing. Meanwhile, state governments, because child protection is a state-based issue, are implementing legislation in their states. So it's constantly evolving. And in fact, in Victoria, we've had it evolving quite rapidly since the betrayal of trust inquiry, which predated the Royal Commission. And so we've had a huge amount of legislative change to make sure that children are safe in organisations, and I think it's been very effective, and we can be proud of that.
Yeah. So it means that child safety is, at least for now, on the agenda. But one of the problems with institutions is the people running them change. And it would seem to me that you need to have a system somehow that is constantly evolving and constantly in the public eye. Do you think the system we're developing is going to achieve that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The system we've developed is one of compliance, legislation and compliance, and so it will depend how much power the regulator has in each state, how effective the system will be, but it also depends on organisations really delving into their culture and making sure that we don't have the toxic culture anymore that led to child sexual abuse in organisations and a lot of forms of abuse. So it's about a willingness to transform culture as well as implement the standards and abide by the legislation. So it's a whole system working together, the organisation, their culture, the legislation and the regulator. So, for example, the Ombudsman's Office in New South Wales, the Commission for Children in Victoria, instrumental in making sure that organisations are complying with the standards, the child safe standards.
But nobody's really checking, are they? So if an organisation that I'm involved in, and a synagogue or a school or a social group isn't complying with standards, is there anything I can do about it?
Well, you can speak to the Commission for Children in Victoria, and I'm sure and the other equivalents in other states. I guess the organisation will come to the attention of the authorities when there's a problem. And that's too late, really.
Absolutely. We want to prevent the problem. So it seems to me that we need training of whoever the new people are involved on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
We also need, and we need to know what the standards are and to know what's expected. So I was talking about a situation to you where there are security guards and the community say, well, we'll let the security guards be responsible. And you said to me, that's not. Do you want to talk to me about that situation a little bit and explain what you said to me about that?
As part of the standards, and I'll talk about Victorian standards, but basically they will be national standards, and they're all the national standards are very similar to the Victorian standards. Training is a requirement, so it requires organisations to refresh training every year. It needs to be a whole of organisation approach. It can't be just a tick box exercise, and it can't be left to one person in an organisation. It is the whole organisation needs to consider children's voices. Are children being heard? Do children and parents know how to make a report if they're concerned about behaviour? What kind of screening and recruitment is going on? What kind of supervision of employees and volunteers is in process? So they're very practical standards, and to implement them requires a whole systemic change of the way that organisational culture runs. So how we do things around here needs to be all focused on child safety.
So you're telling me that there's an institution. Sorry, I'm going to ask a different question than I was going to. I just looked at the time. But in a lot of synagogues, there is somebody who's known as the lolly man. I don't know if all of you go to synagogues where there's a lolly man, but my whole childhood and growing up, and at the shuls I've gone to, both the different shuls I go to regularly and other places, a lolly man is someone in shul who the kids go up to and get lollies. And I was wondering about that because, there are all sorts of things, it's always seemed quite nice, but I wasn't sure. Maybe it's a problem. What do you think about that?
Okay, so I think it is, I think the concept of a lolly man is problematic from a child protection perspective, quite frankly, because we need to have checks and balances in place, and we need to empower children to understand what is acceptable behaviour and what is risk. So we don't want children to be accustomed to taking lollies from someone who is a stranger or an adult at all, really, in a community organisation. Why I'm saying this is because it relates to grooming. So I want to say most people are good people and they don't want to harm children. A small percentage of people do want to harm children, and they engage in what is called grooming behaviour, which you may have heard of. So grooming behaviour consists of things like having favourite children and giving them gifts and endearing themselves to children in a way that suggests that they are trustworthy and that giving the message that the child is special. They usually target children who are vulnerable, and it's a very dangerous setup where you have someone who is given the role of giving out lollies, and you're basically creating a relationship with an adult which is it's always unequal between children and adults, but you're giving that adult a lot of power over children and telling children it's okay to form a bond with this person who is actually probably a complete stranger to them.
And of course, we don't know much about them. I'd just like to repeat what I said with respect to Itai. If you have questions for Catherine, please do type them into the chat, and so we know that there are questions coming. One of the problems in the Jewish community is that we are totally scattered in the way we do things. There's a little group of people who do things here and a little group of people who do things there. There's no authority of any sort. There's, the yeshiva or some communities run under one banner, some run under another. There's no Beth Din that everybody abides by. Lots of people will say, well, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry is in charge of something, but they're in charge of some things, but not other things. And of course, National Council of Jewish Women Australia is in charge of all Jewish women in Australia, in case any of you thought that we weren't. But we don't listen to the authority of any of the other organisations. So how do we, as a community, manage these problems?
Yeah, this is an issue. So as you rightly point out, there is no one authority for the Jewish community, and that is both good and bad because it means that we have no sort of central place where, for example, training is rolled out from, policy is rolled out from, investigations can be, centralised. So, and I'm saying that in comparison to other religious organisations and other religious institutions like, so for example, the churches where they do have central bodies, some of them, not all of them. But so the problem with that is that we have inconsistent and patchy application of child protection. And although everyone's compelled to comply, it's not centralised. So there's a lot of duplication of resources and the quality of implementation of child safety is not consistent, and it's not efficient in the way that we're rolling it. And I think that's just the nature of the way the community is structured. And quite a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I worked with the JCCV in Victoria, and we held communal sessions for child protection, and that was very well attended and very well received. And I think the community really took on the mantle of implementing child protection policies, but that was 4 or 5 years ago, and we need to keep it going, but we need a forum for that to happen.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Danielle, are you keeping a view of the chat and if there are any questions, will you let us know?
Oh, we do have quite a number of questions, so I'm going to try and condense some of them.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the questions we have is, how good is the safety net in our, sorry, somebody else added something to the chat as I was reading that. How good is the safety net in our schools with regards to teachers being able to be aware of signs of sexual abuse?
So I can only speak about Victoria because that's context I know. And I have to say that the Jewish schools have definitely taken on with fervour child protection and have good policies in place, and there's teacher training every year in relation to child safety. So I think that organisations like schools that are used to implementing procedures, policy standards and are very professional are not as concerning as the more less well-resourced organisations and less professional organisations, the more informal organisations.
We've also had a couple of questions about the working with children's checks and the role of the schools in whether they're meant to be checked regularly or what the process is, because I rocked up at my post office and filled in a form and got my little card, and I've volunteered at numerous schools, and sometimes they've been checked and sometimes they haven't, and what obligation is there?
Yeah, it's okay. So for teachers, there's an obligation under the Victorian Institute of Teaching, for example, in Victoria. I'm not sure about the other states if their teachers have special procedures there, but it is up to the organisation to check people's working with children check regularly. So there's a database and they can check the number against the database to make sure the working with children check is still valid. They also need to make sure that the person that has been, that's volunteering with them or working with them has their working with children check registered to them. Because just as you say, if they're working with 5 different organisations, if they registered one organisation with the Working with Children Check Office, only that one organisation will be notified if they commit a crime or a charge with an offence. So that is a definite flaw in the system.
Thank you
very much.
They're all the questions really that we've got so far.
Okay, so please keep the questions coming, and as we'll be able to come back to Catherine at the end of the session, because fortunately I hope she's going to stay. She's implied that she's happy to stay on a bit longer and isn't going to cut me off at the hour. Deborah, I'm sorry we're coming to you so late, but we're now going to go to Deborah Blackman. Deborah's the Director of EduCare, Protecting Our Children Together. She's going to take on really the most difficult task in a way, which is talking about our children, how we recognise signs of sexual abuse, how we talk to our children about this problem, what we do if we find that there's a problem that our children have, and it might be about someone else. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about the work you do first? And I should just say, Deborah, Deborah's in Sydney, and so you could perhaps also talk about the training work that you do in the Sydney schools as well. This is by way of introduction.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. So for around 10 years, my background is in social work. I'm a social worker. For the last 10 years, I've been working in all of the Jewish schools in Sydney, running child protection programs. Over time, I developed a program that was, I guess, culturally appropriate for Jewish schools, Jewish specific. And the program involves workshops for children in primary schools and as well as the early learning centres, so age 3 up until age around 12, year 6. It involves workshops with the children as well as training for staff and workshops for parents as well, information sessions for parents. It's really about everybody being on the same page, everybody who cares for children, using the same language and having the same sorts of conversations in order to make sure our children are safe.
How do you talk to a 3-year-old about this? I mean, aren't they much too young to be brought into this?
They are very young, but I think a child is never too young to be able to start the conversation. And the conversation builds. So I go into the Jewish schools every year and repeat the program from age 3 to age 12. So a 3-year-old 5 years ago has now seen me 5 times, and they're now 8 years old, and they're hearing the same messages every year. The messages are delivered slightly differently. They are age appropriate. We do lots of scenarios and role plays that are age appropriate. But it's never too young to start talking about our bodies, talking about our private parts, understanding the rules about our bodies and our private parts, understanding what to do if somebody makes me feel unsafe or breaks the rules about my private parts. What do I do? Who do I tell? how do I respond? So the conversation can start very young.
Yeah, one of the things that Itai mentioned was the problem in the Hasidic community, or the Haredi community, not necessarily Hasidic community, in the Haredi community, where there is no discussion about body parts, and that this is a particular problem. Is that something that you specifically are able to break down or break into when you're in the schools?
Well, I can tell you that in Sydney, I've worked in the religious schools as well as the non-religious schools. I've done a little bit of work in Melbourne as well. And the religious school, the Haredi school in Melbourne, and the religious schools in Sydney, they are very open to doing what they can to make sure their children are safe. I am as respectful as I can possibly be about the values and the way that they would like the information to be delivered to the children. But they're on board in Sydney and in Melbourne. I can't speak for Israel or anywhere else, but in Sydney and in Melbourne, in my experience, the Haredi schools and every other Jewish school, they're on board with trying to do the right thing, trying to make sure that their institutions are safe for children.
Yeah, I think that's very important that the schools are on board. And as you say, you have to work with people where they are, because otherwise all you do is alienate them. And that's something Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's been on our mind so much in the last few days, was very famous for saying, you know, that if you want to succeed, you don't argue with the other person, you listen to them respectfully. Yes. In the hope that they will listen also respectfully to your view.
That's exactly.
So some words of wisdom there. Deborah, if I've got a child and I'm worried about that child, what are the sorts of things that might alert me to the fact that it might be something to do with sexual abuse?
Well, I guess there are a lot of different indicators, or we might call them red flags, in terms of a child's behaviour that might alert us to the fact that there's something going on for this child and that we need to be concerned. You know, usually there would be a pattern of behaviour that might be observed in a child that might arouse concern in a carer of that child, either a parent or a teacher, a babysitter. I, as a parent, might be concerned about my friend's child because I might observe certain behaviours. So some of those behaviours might be, for example, very sexually explicit behaviour or language that is age inappropriate for that child. So we might wonder how that child knows that information, how that child knows to behave in a certain way or to use certain language. So that might be concerning. Or a child where there is a drastic change in behaviour, almost overnight change in behaviour. So you might have a child in a school who is usually very cooperative and very compliant and participates in class, and who suddenly, almost overnight, becomes the opposite of that. Very, very difficult. Their behaviour becomes very challenging, and it's a very drastic change. It could also be the flip side, where you might have a child who is very disruptive and very uncooperative most of the time, and suddenly overnight they become a very compliant child. So those sorts of drastic changes in behaviour can be signs that something is going on for that child. There could also be, you might also see other signs where you might have a child who tells you as the carer or the teacher that they are scared to go home, or they're scared to go in this person's car or to go with whoever it might be. That can also be a sign that a child expresses fear of a particular place or person. Again, you would want to see some sort of pattern of behaviour with all these things, and none of these behaviours on their own would be a definite indicator that a child has been a victim of some sort of sexual abuse. It would be a red flag, something that you wouldn't want to ignore as a carer of a child. I don't want to ignore this. I want to look into it a bit to find out what's going on. I also don't want to jump to conclusions too quickly.
Yeah, because I would have immediately said, if my child said they wouldn't get into the car with someone, I'd say, stop being a pain in the neck. It's perfectly fine to go in the car. All you're trying to do is to make me do the driving. Or, I would be for sure have some reason why I wouldn't think of it as a red flag.
Right.
But of course,
it might be that you would have a child, a 4-year-old, who says to the teacher in the early learning centre, please don't make me go home with Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe picks me up every Thursday in his car. I don't want to go home with Uncle Joe. Please don't make me go with him. And the child seems genuinely scared to go with Uncle Joe. So that should really raise a little bit of a red flag. It might be, like you said, something as simple as Uncle Joe has really bad breath and I don't want to get in his car because it's yucky. It might be that, or it might be something else. So it needs to there definitely needs to be attention given to that situation.
So let's imagine that my child has changed their behaviour, and alongside with it, they start telling me they don't want to go with Uncle Joe in the car on Thursdays. And the teachers rung me and said, you really should send someone else to get your child on Thursdays because, he's really upset about Uncle Joe. How do I start working out whether this has got anything to do with sexual abuse?
So I think that it would be important to do a few things. I think for the parent and the teacher to be in conversation is a good thing. The teachers spend more time with our children than anybody else. And sometimes we can put a picture together when we have a parent's perception and a teacher's perception of the child's behaviour, and we start to put it together. I think that also parents having conversations with their children in general, whether or not they're concerned about their child, but parents having very open communication with their children about their bodies and about their private parts. Parents often ask me, how do I talk to my child about sexual abuse? I don't want to use words like sexual abuse to my 6-year-old. I don't think we need to use words like sexual abuse to our 6-year-olds, but we do need to talk about everything to our children. Our children need to know that they can tell us everything. Nothing is too terrible. Nothing is too disgusting. I can talk about my private parts. I can mention the names of my private parts because my mother and father speak about my private parts, and we speak about meaning that the language is acceptable. It is okay to use this language. It is okay for me to talk about my body because my parents have given me that message. It's okay for me to talk about it. So when parents and children have open communication on that level, it opens up the channels of communication. If I'm now concerned about my child, I'm able to open the conversation in a general sense by talking about the rule about our bodies and our private parts and asking my child, what would you do if someone broke the rule about the private parts of your body? What would you do in a hypothetical sense to open it up?
That's interesting. So you actually can get to the point where you can give the child a strategy should something happen. So the child knows that so step one is actually to know your body. Is that right? You'd say, that we need to understand our own bodies. And step number 2 is to know that that you can talk to your parents about anything, and hopefully maybe even some other people too, your aunties or whatever it is, that there are people who in your life who you can talk to about anything. And then thirdly, that you actually can have a strategy that says, if such and such a thing happens, then, you've talked, and then third thing is that you've got rules about what should and shouldn't happen to your body, right? So, and those rules are things like nobody should touch your private parts without your permission, or no one should touch them full stop, or what's the rules that we've got?
I guess the way I start off talking to children is that I tell children that you have a right to feel safe. Every single child has a right to feel safe, which means that nobody's allowed to make you feel unsafe or scared. Not even somebody you know, not even somebody you like, and not even an adult. Nobody's allowed to make you feel scared. So if somebody does make you feel scared, we have a rule for what to do. We have a rule for you as children. Here's what you have to do. If somebody makes you feel scared, you need to say no and go away and tell an adult. So it's that no, go tell. Say no, go away, tell an adult.
Right.
I do then say to children that even if you didn't say no, and even if you didn't go away, you still need to tell an adult. And we, in the sessions in the classroom, we brainstorm who are the adults in your life who you could tell, because you have more than one choice of who to tell. You have options of adults. And that's really important, because we don't know which adult, number one, might be the offender, but we also don't know which adult is actually going to listen and believe them and help them. So I tell children, you need to keep on telling until somebody listens and somebody believes you and somebody helps you to feel safe.
That's very, very empowering. So really, we've got to just teach our children to be strong, resilient people, because we can't protect them from being victims, because they're always going to be less powerful. Mm-hmm. So we can only arm them that should they be, because of course the people who are victimized are not, there's not one type of person, and they're not bad people who are victimized. You know, it's sort of bad luck, isn't it? It could happen to any of us, and it's almost bad luck if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, that this might happen to you. Because, you know, one of the things, and Catherine might want to say more about this, but she and I were talking about, is the amount of damage that this has done to people in their lives. So people who are 70 are still recovering to what was done to them when they were 7 or 8. And we can't stop anyone being a victim except helping them to say no and helping them to have strategies, but they still might be the victim. You know, but we can at least then say to them, but if you have become the victim, you can still be strong enough to say something about it, to get help.
Well, what research has shown is that if a child is a victim but reports it immediately, tells an adult immediately, and the adult who the child tells believes the child and does everything they can to make sure that abuse does not happen again, that the long-term impact on that child is far less than if the child had never reported it.
That's incredibly important, isn't it? So immediate intervention,
yes,
can make a massive difference.
Yes.
Okay, I hope people are putting questions into the chat, because I thank you all for staying with us, because we are already over time, but we haven't given Deborah very much of an opportunity to talk to us, because there are just so many things that she's been involved in over time. So Catherine, Deborah, I'm just called, this is very bad, sorry. Fire me as a Zoom conversationalist, Deborah. I think that we have got a list of things we need to do, but of course it's not so easy to do it. You know, we've got, you know, particularly, you know, we're all working at the same time as we've got our children, and, you know, there's always things going on in the household, and the children are here, there and everywhere, and you've got to drive them around everywhere. So I believe my child, but what do I do next?
So I think a lot depends on what the child has told you or what your concerns are about that child. But I think that a very good first step in terms of trying to get to access some sort of support for the child, if it's my child, for my child, and for us as a family, how would I get the support that I think we need if I'm concerned about my child? I think that the first step would be to have a consultation with the school where my child attends. Like I said earlier, I think that teachers spend so much time with our children, and they will add to the picture, you know, whatever behaviour they have observed. And schools are also incredibly resourceful. There are school counsellors on site, and there are also schools will have a referral base, and they will be able to direct parents and families about where and how to access appropriate support.
Okay, so I need some sort of support, but aren't most of the supports around really for adults? Things like Sakasa, and I might ask Debbie Lewis this question. If I've got a child, can I come to you and tell you that I think my child is being sexually abused?
Absolutely. We do work with children.
So, okay, so you actually see children as well?
Yeah.
And do you see families? Deborah mentioned the problem, because obviously the problem, you're going to have a child who is, as you say, it's highly unlikely that there will not be behavioural problems associated with whatever's going on. the whole family might end up in a mess. So would you see other people in the family as well?
Yeah, we can see anyone who where the victim survivor has anyone in the family who's affected. Yeah.
Okay, so and if I ring up as a parent, I mean, are people likely to believe me if I say, or will people just say, come on, it's your child's just, doing all right. Suddenly they've stopped doing so well at school. Well, maybe they I don't know.
I don't think
hormonal.
Yeah, no, I don't think you'd call because you think something. It's usually when there's evidence that something's happened, then you come to us. Yeah, but definitely that we do have an intake. We have an intake, a number that's every day being run, and that would be where you would call to talk about your concerns, and that's when they could refer to another agency or say come and see a counsellor here. So that would go through the intake.
So thank you very much, Debbie. That's really helpful because this could happen to any of us, as I said. Please continue putting chats in the chat box. But while you are doing that, I'm just going to put up on my screen some phone numbers that you might like to write down. I think it's very important to let's see, is that sharing the screen now? Okay, yes? Okay, so you can see here that I've said who to go to. The first person to go to in all of these cases is to 1800 RESPECT, and it actually spells out 1800 737 732. And then I've got the numbers here for the various rape crisis centres, and that's the relevant centre to go to because although it says rape, sexual abuse is covered under that title in many places. It says rape or sexual assault or incest, or each of the centres here are the ones to go to. So there's a number there for the ACT, for New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria and Western Australia. You can go to the CASA, C-A-S-A website, and they have all the Australian resources more fully than I've got them here. But please note down any of those resources. Now, as we are well and truly over time, I'm wondering, Danielle, are you in a position to put any of the questions? Are there some questions there that you've got for Deborah?
Absolutely. We have a few questions. And actually both Deborahs might be able to answer one of them, which is how do we help an adult who was sexually abused as a child get through the trauma? So can you come to SACASA 20 years later, 30 years later, rather than it's a brand new situation?
I can't see. I've lost the screen. Has anyone else?
Yeah, I'll stop her sharing.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, absolutely. We've got clients who come many, many, many years later, and I think that Catherine and Deborah would be able to verify this, that some people often don't talk for a long, long time. So we can have from childhood abuse, but only telling us as much older adults. Yeah.
And then we have a question about shouldn't the answer be to go to the police? So if a child actually reports abuse, what should we as parents do? As in it's not just suspicious, it's actual somebody saying that something has happened.
Yes, so then absolutely, the first call would be to the police. So the question earlier was, am I worried? I'm worried about my child. I'm not aware of anything absolute or definite, but I'm worried. So that would be a different question. If my child has disclosed that something definite has happened, here is what happened to me and here's the person who did it, my first call would be to the police. No question.
Fabulous. We have another question, which is about, you talked about going into schools and training teachers and training children, but are there programs to train parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and other people in children's lives that...
Yeah, Absolutely. So as part of my work in schools, I call it a 3-tiered program. So there's training for staff, there's the workshops for the children, and there's always an information session for parents that's offered at the same time. I've also done many parent sessions outside of the school setting, just groups of interested parents. You know, one parent will hear what I've done and ask me to do a session for a group of their friends. And in private homes, I've done that. It's, in lots of different settings.
And then one of the questions we had earlier was about school holiday programs being run by teenagers, and obviously they're not necessarily able to get a working with children's check if they're under 18, and they're constantly moving on. But we also have the same issue, especially around the Yom Norim, where there's lots of children normally in synagogues and stuff. So how do we ensure we're protecting in these situations where it's not like a school is a regular situation, your regular community and every Shabbos is pretty much the same. It doesn't change a lot, but these alternative situations where we're faced with a lot of new people, how do we ensure that people are trained and we're putting our best efforts in?
So I've done quite a bit of work with a lot of schools in Sydney. I've helped them to develop their child protection policies, and I've done a lot of training with all of the youth workers in a lot of schools in Sydney, and also with the youth groups in Sydney. So I would, in answer to your question maybe about shul, usually in a normal world, lots of children in shul, especially this time of year. I would answer that on 2 levels. So number one, I would want to know that the people who are working with children in the shul are trained in this area. And number 2, as a parent, I want to speak to my child about what happens when my child is at shul. What are the rules for my child when we go to shul? So if I can't see my child and I don't know where my child is, what's my child's responsibility? Do they have to come and tell me? So if I know my child is in a particular room at a particular activity, if that changes, they need to come and tell me. So I would go through the rules with my child. What are the expectations for my child in a shul setting?
So I have a follow-up question to that, and then I'll actually open that question up to Catherine as well, because she looked like she had some, which is, but what do you do when other parents are dismissive of this issue and saying, well, my kids can kind of run around and do whatever they want, and you're the strict parent who said to your children, and that they don't necessarily respond because all their friends are off playing because the other parents don't see it as an issue?
So I would say to that as a parent, as that parent in a shul, I would then want to approach the shul to say, can you provide some education for all of the parents in this shul, and perhaps provide some guidelines and even some boundaries about where children should be and what's okay for children while they're at shul.
Okay. Catherine, that question I had before about what we do in these changing community situations, you looked like you had something to add.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Deborah. She completely said everything I was going to say. That really is, synagogues need to have codes of conduct. They need to have working with children checks. They need to have clear expectations around what adults can do. Even if there's only, many children there once a year, it doesn't matter. They need to have protocols in place. They need to adhere to the child safe standards.
Absolutely. And then one of the questions, and I'm not sure who to sort of address this to, there's a question about what to do when it's older children, younger children, potentially like we often think of predators as being adults, but we know that in lots of cases it's teenagers and other people who have been through other things. How do we address this? Is this when we include the police or not police? Like, it's a very tricky question, so I'm not sure which of the 3 of you would like to answer that.
I could say that at Sakasa, another thing, I'm not part of this program, but there is, I can't think what it's called, but it's the harmful sexual behaviours program, AWARE, I think it's called, and there are counsellors who work with the teenager possibly, or the child who's offending. And then we've got the counsellors who work with the victim survivor. So that's another thing that SACASA can offer.
Fabulous. That's all the questions that I currently can see in the chat.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I'm just wondering whether, Deborah, you'd like to say one last thing, and then Catherine, and then we will just finish off. Deborah.
I guess just thank you for providing this forum. I think that in general the topic of child sexual abuse needs to be a communal topic, a communal subject. It's not a private matter. So I think you mentioned that earlier. We all as a community have a responsibility in our Jewish community to make sure every single child is safe in every institution and in every home in our Jewish community. So I think it's really important to have forums such as this where this is the topic and this is being discussed. So thank you for that opportunity.
Well, we very much appreciate having you, and Shana Tova specifically to you. Catherine.
Yeah, I totally agree with Deborah. It's great that you've organised this forum. Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's great to have an opportunity to address people around Australia who are interested in hearing about this. And it really does require ongoing effort, ongoing communication, ongoing forums, training opportunities, and discussion to make sure this stays on the agenda and we keep protecting children to the best we can.
Thank you very much. It looks like National Council, and Shana Tova specifically to you. Debbie, do you want to say something? Do you have a last thing that you'd like to add?
I'd only like to add that it was amazing. What a wonderful forum. Kol hakavod that you've organised this, and yeah, thank you very much for having us.
And that's my pleasure, Shana Tova, to you specifically.
Shana Tova.
Now, I'd like to say to everybody here, first of all, I'd like to say Shana Tova to all of you. Thank you for joining us in the midst of all the festivities and our very unusual experience of Rosh Hashanah. Yes, you might like to join Danielle and others in giving a round of applause to all of our speakers, or putting a clap on the screen for those who know how to do it, or you can do it silently. We've all obviously got a lot more work to do in this area. This is a topic that's on NCJWA's agenda in an ongoing way. And this evening would not have happened without my advocacy committee and the rest of my board. For those of you who are on the call, I'd like to say thank you very much to you. I particularly mention Rebecca Burrows and Mel Drinkwater, who are the two main people who've been involved in our advocacy effort at the moment. But of course, the whole board has been involved in this. Tonight, I'd like to thank Danielle, our Zoom master, and Debbie, our project manager. There are two things that I'd like to say as well. One is that with respect to Malka Leifer, the matter is not over. Until she's in Australia and before a court, the matter is ongoing. We have on our website some draft letters that you can send to your local member of parliament to encourage them to continue to be involved in this matter. Please go to the website and sign on to the letter and send it off to your member of parliament. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you have a project that you would like to do with respect in this area, or in fact in other areas, but in this area because it's one of the areas that we are very concerned about, please come to us and tell us what you're thinking and your ideas. I cannot promise that we will do every project that everybody comes up with. I can't promise particularly anything that we can do, but we are trying to meet the needs of the community, and with your help, with the help of every single one of you, we can deal with a lot of these issues in an ongoing way. So if there is an issue that you would like to be on our agenda, tell us. If there is something that you would like to be involved in, tell us, because we need people to make things happen. So if you are available, tell us. And if there's anything that you think we should be doing, let us know. We are trying to meet the needs of our community, and that's the only way we can do it, is if people speak with us. Thank you all very, very much for your patience, for staying so late. It's so much later than I had hoped to be. Thank you especially again to our speakers, because all of you, Itai, who's no longer here, was just wonderful to come in from Israel, and how wonderful an opportunity it's given me to meet Deborah and Catherine and Debbie, to meet the three of you as well. It's been wonderful. And to all of you, Shana Tova, and we'll see you at our next event. Good night.